Hi, this is Randall Schwartz, host of FLOSS Weekly. This week, Aaron Newcomb joins me. We're going to be talking about Redis, the key value store used by the largest corporations in the world. You're not going to want to miss this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for FLOSS Weekly is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is FLOSS Weekly with Randall Schwartz and Aaron Newcomb, episode 441, recorded July 12th, 2017, Redis. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by the Amazon Aurora from AWS, a relational database engine that's compatible with MySQL and PostgreSQL, which provides up to 5 times the performance on the same hardware at a tenth of the cost. Check it out at aurora.aws. It's time for FLOSS Weekly, the show about free, libre, open source software. I am your host, Randall Schwartz, Merlin at Stonehenge.com, bringing you each week the movers, the shakers, the big projects, the little projects, the projects you may be using every day and unaware of it. I bet today's is actually going to be one of those. Projects you might want to download and play with right after this show. And I bet today's is also going to be one of those. Joining me today is my lovely and talented co-host, Aaron Newcomb. Aaron, welcome back.
Hey, thanks, Randall. It sounded a little bit like you had your Batman voice going on there.
What Batman voice?
There you go.
Actually, I was screaming in a very loud place last night, trying to talk to a couple of my friends, and the place was just. So if my voice is a little scratched today, it's because yes, it was a little bit crazy there. Anyway, hey, so it's been so long since we've had you on, like all of last week. But last week's was very appropriate to have you on, and this week's again, you specifically asked to be on the show about Redis, and why is that?
Yeah, so actually, the company I work for is developing some integrations with Redis right now, and we're working on it. And so, you know, I'm being a little bit selfish here in that I want to learn a little bit more about what Redis is doing, so that I can be more informed when we start talking about the integration we're working on.
Well, let's put a little context to this first. Oh, before we do that, we have to do this week in locations. So I am currently in the Santa Monica office again of ZipRecruiter with an entirely different background because the two conference rooms I normally use are both in use this week. So I went to yet another conference room here. And you look like you're in a slightly different location too. I think you're at work, but in a different room.
Yeah, I keep trying to get the room with the good view, but I keep ending up in the sound studio, which is a good thing. I mean, there's carpeted walls, so, you know, the sound's not bouncing around too much. But if you look around, you can't see, actually. If you look around, I'm going to drive John nuts now. There's like, I'm in the sound studio, so there's like musical equipment and things like that. Yeah, so it's kind of cool. This is a place for people to come chill out, or if they want to practice their next guitar solo for their big concert or something, they can do that.
Right. Well, let's provide just a little bit more context for this show, too, because Redis is an open source, BSD licensed, in-memory data structure store. Uses database cache and message broker. It comes right from their website. I just read that. I didn't actually make that up. But it's apparently the #1 key value store out there. And this is also called a NoSQL database and things like that. This one's somewhat unique in that it's all in memory, so it's extremely fast. There's ways of serializing and persisting some of the data, but primarily it's an in-memory database that scales well. One master, multiple slaves. Actually, our guest will know a lot more about that. Our guest is Tague Griffith. He's working with Redis. He's sort of the developer advocate, so he's the one that would talk to people like us as we're part of the community. So anything more you want to add to that before we start getting into the show?
No, only that, you know, from what I've heard in the community and from our customers is that it seems to be a little bit more enterprise ready, I would say, in terms of doing things like, you know, automatic replication and things like that to keep all the data protected. So I'm kind of curious from that angle too. I mean, it seems like I don't know a lot about the history of Redis. We'll find out in a minute, but it seems like they've really vaulted into some of the more advanced enterprise features that you don't normally find with an open source project at the beginning.
Cool. Okay, well, before we bring Tague on, I do have a little bit of business to do here because this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by the Amazon Aurora from Amazon Web Services. To build the kinds of things that developers want to build today, they need better tools, super tools, like a database that will grow as your business grows and is easy to manage. That's why AWS built Amazon Aurora, a relational database engine that's compatible with MySQL and PostgreSQL and provides up to 5 times the performance of standard MySQL on the same hardware. The Amazon Aurora can scale up to millions of transactions per minute, can automatically grow your storage up to 64 terabytes if need be, can replicate 6 copies of your data to 3 different availability zones, and tolerates failures and even automatically fixes them and continually backs up your data to Amazon S3. And Amazon RDS fully manages it all, so you don't have to. If you're already using Amazon RDS for MySQL, you can migrate to Amazon Aurora with just a few clicks. So what you're getting is up to 5 times better performance than MySQL with the security, availability, and reliability of a commercial database, all at a tenth of the cost. No upfront charges, no commitments, and you only pay for what you use. So check out aurora.aws and start imagining what you can build with Amazon Aurora from AWS. That's AURORA.AWS. And we thank them for their support of FLOSS Weekly. And let's go ahead and bring Tague on. Tague, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And where are you speaking to us from?
I'm actually speaking to you from the Redis Labs office in Mountain View, California.
Cool. And so give us the 30,000-foot view. What problem is Redis solving? Why would I reach for it?
Sure. So one of the big problems that Redis tries to solve is very, very fast and very, very simple NoSQL database. I think as you touched on, one of the things with Redis is it's very unique in the NoSQL space. Instead of having sort of a table structure that kind of mirrors what we see in relational databases, Redis works off of data structures you're already familiar with, things you find in your language collection libraries, now represented in server form.
Okay, so I would take this. I wouldn't use normal traditional SQL to do things like inserts and updates and things like that. I interact with it differently. Then how does that work?
Yeah, for instance, if you wanted to do something around, recommendations are very popular. So Redis has the concept of a sorted set, which is a set, but that has actual ordering applied to it. So you might insert your recommendations into a sorted set with the order being how good of a recommendation it is. So you work with set semantics, but your set, instead of being local to the node that your code is running on, runs on or lives on a remote database-like server, a NoSQL database, and you interact with it remotely.
And what would a typical use case be for this, though?
There's all sorts of things. Most people start with Redis. They come to it as a cache. That's probably the most popular use case for Redis because they start with just basic key value pairs. Recommendations are really good. Counting large objects. There's a data type in Redis called hyperloglog that makes it very easy to sort of do a probabilistic count of billions of items in a fixed memory size.
So is this something that would be used in parallel with, or or to maybe replace Memcached?
You could use it in either situation. You can use it as a replacement for Memcache if you want to just do key value storage. You can also use it in conjunction with with Memcache for caching. For instance, if you have, say, a large fan-out computation that maybe hits, your SQL database, a couple of different systems, you can basically do your fan-out computation once, compute the results, and then store it in Redis in a form that makes it readily accessible. Because again, the big difference between, say, using Redis as a cache for Memcache is Memcache gives you purely key value storage, whereas with Redis you get key to data type storage.
So how would this differ from some of the other NoSQL solutions like document stores? I'm trying to think of a few, but we've done like dozens of them on this show, but I can't remember any of the names right now. But how does this differ from a standard document store where I send down a pile of JSON and then get the maybe can do searches and queries across that, maybe some data reduction across that? How does this differ from that?
Sure. So really, I think, again, it comes down to data structures. So you as a developer would construct things like lists or sets or hash tables, things you already have in your programming language. And so you're not working in, documents. You're really working in smaller data units and structuring your code around the data structures that you want to use. Only now they're remote data structures versus being local.
And how did Redis get started?
So Redis started in 2009 as an open source project by Salvatore Sanfilippo. Still is actively involved in Redis. In fact, Salvatore just announced that he's planning on releasing the 4.0 version of Redis we're down to about 3-4 days now. He's talking on that the release will come out on July 14th. So that's, kind of the pretty big, exciting news in open source Redis.
Cool. I know we're already geeking out as we do on this show, but I want to bring it back because I know some of the people I talk to that aren't database administrators might not have a clue in terms of what a data structure even is. So I think that's I think that's a good descriptor for those of us that are in the know in terms of you're focused on arranging the data by data structure. But what is a data structure to begin with? Like, give us some examples of data structures.
Sure. So if you look at data structures, are really different models or ways of organizing data. Various data structures have different properties in terms of how you can access them, how expensive it is to do certain operations, and then what kind of the memory storage or sort of resource requirements for a data structure are. And so maybe taking an example in Redis, one of the data structures is a string. And really, when you look at a string in Redis, it's really just a buffer of memory, some bits or some bytes that you store on the server. So one of the data structures would be, I have a key or a name, and I look that up and I get a string result. And that's basically just a buffer of memory. Another data structure coming out of Redis is simply a list. And you could think of that in just a real world analogy is like you take a piece of paper, you write down 4 or 5 items in order. And so a list in Redis is very similar, is that you can add things to the list, you can remove things, kind of the paper analogy would be to cross them off, but they have an order. And, it takes a certain amount of time to walk through every item in the list. So that the structure of a list sort of affects how operations, how much they cost, what the resources are that you use them. Or you need to use to support them.
But doesn't that get a little tricky? And again, I'm coming from more of a relational database, traditional database background. But doesn't that get a little tricky keeping those data structures together when you might need to do, you might not just be looking for that particular data structure. In other words, what I'm thinking of is if I'm looking up customer information, for example, I need to look up a name. I need to look up a list of phone numbers. Maybe there's some other data types in there. Maybe there's a blob that I have to look up. A blob is like a big file in a database. Yeah. So maybe there's a picture, for example, that I need to look up of that person's profile, and that's a blob. So, so logically to me, it would seem illogical to keep things by data structure because now I've kind of got to look in different places to find all those different data types if I pull back a customer record. Long explanation to say, how does Redis solve for this?
Sure. So I think if you look at both Redis and the NoSQL, one of the you really have to approach it from a different perspective than you would a relational database. Because when we look at relational databases, normally we look at normalization, trying to keep similar data together to keep one uniform source of truth in our tables. We work our data down to third normal form. With NoSQL and then with Redis in particular, you really have to look at not your data, but your query patterns. How are you going to be accessing that data? And that's how you drive how you structure it in Redis. And so a lot of times, like you might have denormalization in a SQL database to improve certain performance. You do very similar patterns with Redis. You will denormalize your data to drive performance in your queries. Does that make sense for someone coming from more of a relational database background versus a developer programming background?
Yeah, I think so. I think it does. And I'm just trying to up level a little bit here to catch people that might not be deep into NoSQL database land here. Another question I have is the in-memory aspect of this. How does that work? And does this mean I'm going to need gobs of memory on, each of my nodes? Because this is a node-based architecture, correct?
Correct. So ultimately, you have to be able to fit all of your all of your data that you're serving into ROM or into RAM, into core memory. Redis does provide persistence for storing and saving that data, but all of the data is served out of core memory, is served out of RAM. So there's not, when you have like a MySQL or most databases where you page data in and out. It's all resident in RAM, and that's part of why Redis gets the high performance that it gets. So yes, you will have to build out a sufficient amount of RAM to store your data.
Okay, and then isn't that a risk then because memory, obviously the obvious benefit there to keeping it in memory is that memory is fast, so you can get to your data faster. You can reduce the time for the transaction, and even relational databases are heading in that direction too. All the big commercial ones are heading in the direction of some sort of in-memory component. But the question that begs the question then, if this is a distributed architecture to some degree, and because memory is so fast and because network latency or network speeds are so much slower, isn't there a problem then in doing things like replication and keeping transactions updated on multiple hosts? Because the transaction goes in and out of memory really quick on a single node, but then when you have to replicate that across multiple nodes, it's going to take some time, and there's going to be a period of time where if one node goes down, you might lose some transactions or some data.
Right. I mean, with any, I think, distributed system, you're gonna to sort of face a lot of those challenges. The way Redis tries to address it is really trying to keep sort of very shared nothing nodes, and essentially trying to partition your results, your actions across multiple nodes. Redis doesn't support distributed transactions the way you might see in a relational database. So really your transactional interaction is kind of with the node proper, if that makes sense.
That does, actually. So I introduced you at the beginning of the show as the community coordinator. Is that your role, and how do you do that?
Sure. So my role is, or maybe a clarification I should make. I work for Redis Labs, which is, we sponsor the open source Redis project. So I do developer advocacy and community coordination for Redis developers, regardless of how they get that, whether it's, the pure open source, whether it's an our version of the open source product. And so what I do is a lot of, conference speaking, tutorial development, writing, blogging, talking to technical folks about the capabilities of Redis.
Okay, and actually, since you brought up Redis Labs, so is that how most of the development for Redis gets funded? Is the commercial version of Redis?
So our project is slightly different. So there's actually many different commercial vendors of Redis. We happen to sponsor the open source project. So we sponsor Redis IO. We also provide both financial and technical contributions back to the product, to the open source community. And then as well as we have our own enterprise version that we sell to our customers. So I want to make kind of that clear distinction, to be very respectful of the effort and energy that the open source community puts into Redis, that there is, Redis IO and open source Redis, and then there's us as a commercial provider of an open source project.
Well, how does that work then? Do the employees of Redis Labs participate as equal-footed participants in the open source version?
Yeah, so we contribute into the open source version technical changes the same way anyone would submit so Redis is hosted on GitHub. So we submit pull requests to make changes to the open source project. some of the work we've done around extensions to Redis, we've done as open source modules. And then, there's the work that we do as a commercial provider to build a business. So Salvatore, the founder of Redis, is an employee of ours in a very, essentially we sponsor him so that he can work purely on open source Redis. And he does that in a very vendor neutral way. As I mentioned, there are multiple vendors who provide various commercial versions of Redis, and we just happen to be one of them, and we try to be very actively involved in both our work and as the open source community.
Okay, and so what would be an example of something that would be offered in your premium version that wouldn't be in the open source version?
Sure. So we were talking before about the memory costs of, and RAM is one of those expensive resources. We've added to the enterprise version basically the ability to use SSDs and flash to cache data that's not hot and not affect your serving performance. So you get very close to the same in-memory serving performance using flash, so you reduce your costs for in-memory.
Okay, and so let's go back then to how Salvatore works into this. So is he basically still deciding the roadmap for what's going to be in Redis 4 and Redis 5 and Redis 6 then?
So he's very much continues to run the project. He tries to be very open and transparent about what he's doing with Redis, and then he puts those things out in the community. So, for instance, he wanted to start looking at doing a streams data type for Redis. So he put out sort of a call for proposals, call for comment out into the community to get anyone who's interested to contribute, to talk about ideas, talk about how this should work. And his Redis roadmap is his roadmap. And he and the folks that he brings in from the open source community run that entirely independently of any of the vendors. So it very much is a unique open source project that happens to have vendor support behind it.
What's some of the more interesting uses you've seen for a Redis installation?
A lot of the examples I go back to, I used to work at Flickr, so I talk a lot about some of the things Flickr has done because Flickr was an early Redis adopter and actually built off of open source Redis. So when Flickr added news feeds or photo feeds of friends, we built it on top of Redis, and we built it as a way of essentially caching and doing a bit of a Lambda architecture where you do these very expensive fan-out queries that hit multiple systems to construct your friend's photo feed, and then you do real-time deltas against that. I've seen people do sort of fraud detection systems, heavy caching. A system that I was involved in and personally helped build, we're doing 25 billion operations a day using a cluster of open source Redis. So there's just, it's one of these things that's very ubiquitous in developers' toolkits. And it's kind of all over the place. I'm trying to remember the last time I had an engineering job where Redis wasn't a significant part of the architecture.
Yeah, well, I even asked the guys around here at ZipRecruiter if we use Redis, and they actually use the Elastic Cache, which is the AWS version of Redis. So
right.
Yeah, it's a key component here. But now that brings to mind then, would I ever use a Redis installation as an only source of truth for something, or would I only use it as a caching system?
I think most people start as caching, and that's a great way to get a handle on Redis. But you can use it as a primary data store, and the persistence features that Redis provides will give you the same level of durability that you can get out of, say, a Postgres installation. So there's actually two modes of durability that Redis provides, and they're tunable so that you can tune off your data loss and your durability versus performance.
And I saw some references in the documentation as I was skimming it this morning to atomic operations and to transactions. Can you tell me more about that?
Sure. Transactions in Redis are maybe a bit different than you think about them in a relational database. Redis, the data processing part of the data manipulation part of Redis, the in-memory data manipulation, is all single-threaded. So transactions so that you've got your kind of concurrency control there. And so what transactions are, for the most part, are putting together a set of Redis operations that you want to run like a sequence of operations atomically. Any single Redis operation is going to be atomic in the sense that it's the only operation running at that time. So every operation is essentially atomic. It's when you need to perform multiple operations in Redis as a sequence, as a series, that you have to use the transaction features to ensure that they're executed atomically.
And just back to a little bit more of the programming questions. You said, so I'm thinking that some of the data structures I was looking at that Redis can manage are things like, well, I'm real familiar with Perl, so I'll start with Perl,
Right.
like Perl's hashes and arrays. Is that a good match for it?
Yeah, so Redis has a hash data type, the standard dictionary where you map a key to then essentially a string or a buffer value in Redis. And then you can do operations like get subsets of the keys back at one time, or set a subset of the keys. You could get one key back. You could get all of the keys back at once. But it's very similar to, like you say, a Perl hash or associative array.
Okay, that makes sense then. And how deeply nested can these be? Infinitely, or all around on memory, I guess?
Basically, it's a single level of hash. So you would basically be mapping to essentially scalar buffer items. So you couldn't have in most programming languages, whatever your associative array or dictionary type is generally infinitely nesting. With Redis, you're basically the Redis hash is a key to a buffer value. So it's essentially a scalar.
Oh, okay. So I was thinking that this is much more nested. Okay, so you basically have the equivalent of a one-level hash where the values will have to be strings, or a one-level array. You can keep that sorted. There was a sorted list thing in there. And also, I saw this thing. It's somewhat unrelated to data structures, but this thing called increment, atomic update. Can you describe why I would want to use that?
Sure. So when you look at Redis, all of your data structures are, as we've talked about, are living on the server. So, for instance, if I have, say, a counter that I'm running in Redis, what I do as a programmer, what my client does, is it sends a command to increment that counter. So instead of pulling the value of the counter down to the node where my code is running, I just tell Redis to increment the counter by a certain value. So that's how you help ensure atomicity. And so you don't get interleaved instructions, is instead of doing a read, update, and then write back to the server loop, I send a command to Redis that says increment by 5. Redis adds the value of 5 to my counter. So the transactionality is preserved.
Okay, hey, so one of the other things you said in the material you sent us is that you worked on Mozilla and had some impact on making Mozilla open source?
I worked on both so my second job out of college was working for Netscape, and I worked at Netscape on communicator and server products, and at the time when Mozilla was open source. So I was not actively involved in the open source decision and the sort of the initial committee that maintained Mozilla.org. But I was involved in sanitizing our code, and then once Mozilla was live, working with developers outside of Netscape to add functionality to Mozilla, help merge those changes, help answer questions, things like that.
Yeah, and back then we didn't have Git, so it was a lot harder.
Yeah, it was. I think Mozilla and Netscape is, if you look back in that history, is some very, very interesting ideas came out that really, even in only about the last 10 years, have really matured and become a part of our common developer process, parlance, culture, whatever you want to call that. Netscape was, I think, one of the first people or companies kind of doing continuous integration and delivery through Tinderbox. And now, everyone does that. There were very few people who had made the transition from a closed source base to an open source base. I mean, if you go back, there's actually a movie about the time period when Mozilla was basically trying to take what was a closed source base and turn it into an open source base. And it kind of forget all the, there's a lot of challenges in doing that.
A lot like what?
One of the problems I faced is I worked at the internationalization group at the time, and we had licensed the library. And all of our code was based on this particular library, but it was licensed, so we didn't own it and couldn't release it. So we had to either convince the owner to open source it, or stub it out as fast as we could, and provide the basic functionality. We ultimately ended up stubbing it out because we couldn't convince the owner to open source it. And then probably about 3 to 6 months down the road, they actually did open source the library.
Good timing, bad timing, whatever. Yes.
Very bad timing.
I know that's one of the problems that Apple has had in making a completely open source version of their Mac OS, because some of it uses libraries that they've purchased or licensed instead of having the actual rights to. So I can appreciate that you had some similar issues there. And I guess that gave you good training then for what you're doing now, because you're talking about working for a commercial company that is working closely with an open source community, and you have to make sure changes are coordinated. So was that a good experience for you before you got here?
Yeah, I think, I think one of the things that's really changed since then is the tools. I mean, GitHub makes things so much easier, and thinking about how really distributed teams and distributed contributors can actually put changes into a process. Back then we were using CVS as our version control system. The only way, yeah. People forget those days. When CVS wasn't a pharmacy, it was a version control system, and there was, we had to take patches by essentially diff. And then, somebody internal to the project would have to go through the whole process of applying it, make sure it compiled, make sure other changes that had come in hadn't stomped on it. So there was so much friction to getting contributors' contributions into an open source project. And you couldn't just give everyone, write or commit access. That didn't work either. And, so there had to be all these, sort of processes for, opening up who got, write access, who got commit access. And now, Git has really just drastically reduced the friction to get contributions into an open source base.
Yeah, one of the most important things that people keep forgetting that Git does for us is computing that common ancestor, so that three-way diffs actually make sense. Because if you just have a single diff between two different versions of a file, you can't tell if you've got a third version of the file which side the changes are against or for. And people forget that that's one of the best things about Git is the common ancestor is always in there.
Yeah. No, I think Git has really just really changed the game around open source and reducing the friction on contributions.
Cool. And actually, since there are other people in other companies that have your relative role, in other words, working for a commercial institution, but somehow having to work with an open source community, are there any things you've learned over the years that tips and advice you could give to somebody like that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm necessarily the guy to be giving advice yet. I've been in the role as I've been in the role of the advocate for about 6 months. Prior to that, most of my history has been as a contributor, as a developer. So I figure I need about 6 more months in the actual advocacy role before I'm really the guy to give advice. But I do think there are some things, some principles that everyone should keep in mind that not necessarily specific to my role, is that always respect your community and respect the open source community. Regardless whether they're a paying customer, they are still your customer. They are still part of the people you need to support and help out. And always maintaining a good, positive relationship there, I think, is key. You can't think of your community as, your great commercial people and then the open source guys. It's one community that are just at different stages and different needs.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much for that. We're almost out of time, but is there anything we didn't ask today that you want to make sure our audience is aware of?
No, like I said, I think the big, really exciting thing to re-stress for everyone is in a few days, we're going to have Redis 4.0 released in the open source, which has this really new, awesome modules feature to make it easier to extend and build functionality into Redis. And I hope everyone who uses Redis in their stack will try out the new features and maybe even contribute back.
Oh, and one thing I forgot to bring up is that Redis seems to be programmable in Lua. What's that like?
Yeah, so it's funny you bring up Lua, as I've just talked about modules. So Lua has basically been the scripting language for Redis to do server-side or database programming. So for the folks in the database world, that would be more equivalent to your PL SQL, your sort of procedural database programming language. So that it's very useful to do things that Redis add business logic, add logic that Redis can't support transactionally, particularly if you need to base an action off of the results of a read. It's very difficult to do that as a purely transactional operation in Redis. So a lot of people extend Redis using Lua to kind of build those transactional operations in those categories. Now, what both the community has really learned over the past few years is that Lua is not the end all be all of extensibility in Redis, and that it has some really great power, but it's also not the best way of really extending Redis in other directions. And so that's where the module system comes in. Is the big thing with 4.0 is there's an API for adding dynamically loadable modules. And so that's kind of a whole new story in the sort of scripting and extensibility story around Redis.
Cool. And what language do those modules have to be written in?
C, C++ for now. Actually, one of our Redis engineers, our Redis Labs engineers is a big Go fan and did a bit of a shim so that you can write modules in Go. But really, right now, it's mostly C and C++.
Well, Tague, I really appreciate the time that you took to be on the show today. Oops, I have two more questions. Sorry, I forgot. Otherwise, my audience will yell at me.
That's okay.
What's your favorite scripting language?
Oh, that's a loaded question for this one.
Yes.
Well, I'm going to be honest. I'm actually a Python guy.
Okay, that's okay.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I feel bad.
What do you mean that's okay? That's awesome. Python's awesome.
Aaron, go back. Go away.
I've done a lot of my text. So these days I mostly use TextMate, but in the VI versus Emacs wars, I'm actually an Emacs guy.
Yay! Aww. Yay, Emacs! Yay! All right, I got 1 out of 2. 1 out of 2. Thank you for that, Tague. It's been wonderful having you on the show today, talking about Redis, exposing this to many, many more people, and hopefully they'll participate in the community and be as excited as you are about the new module system. It sounds like that's going to be a really interesting thing to add to this and make it even more and more cool for more and more people. So thank you, Tague, for coming on the show.
I think it will be. Thank you for having me. I had a great time.
Awesome. That was Tague Griffith talking to us about Redis and Redis Labs. Aaron, what'd you think?
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, it's another, NoSQL database. I think that, running in memory has some really cool benefits, obviously, for, it's amazing to think about billions of transactions, right? It's just crazy when you start building out applications and you never have any clue how big it's going to get, and all of a sudden you're doing billions of transactions. That's nuts. So yeah, I think it's very cool. I mean, I think they're doing some really cool stuff. I know a lot of our customers are using Redis, throughout their application supporting infrastructure. So, and I don't know, like I said, as a more of a relational database kind of guy, I kind of like the fact that this is running on a separate server in the background where I can load it up with lots of memory, hopefully never run out, and just let the thing cook, right? So yeah, for me, I kind of like the direction they're going. Like I said at the beginning, I like the fact that for me at least, it feels like a little bit more of an enterprise play for really big applications, but sounds like it would also do just fine for smaller applications that just need a NoSQL database, a fast NoSQL database.
Yeah, and a couple of things we didn't talk on because there's like this thing. This thing appears to be really mature in the sense that they're constantly adding really, really cool solving specific needs kinds of things, like the new modules plugin, the plugin system. That sounds interesting. And the fact that it can be programmed in Lua. A couple of things that we didn't mention during the show, during the interview, were things like it has a LRU cache, but they've just added an LFU cache, which is something that says will eliminate the least frequently accessed cached items. And I thought that was cool. I don't think I've seen anybody else do that before. So they said it's somewhat experimental, but there's tuning knobs for it. And they said, give it a try and tell us how it's working. And I like that. I like that they're innovating along different areas along that line. And also I saw somebody do an excellent, one of the articles that was linked was an excellent rate limiting system. So some way to use the built-in stuff in Redis to allow you to throttle an API for a particular user or something. That was pretty smart too. So yeah, because you can have both expire time and a count, an atomic count, and so you can set that right on an API and have the user ID be the key, and just keeps incrementing the count. When the count gets to 255 or whatever for a given time setting, boom, they're gone. So I thought it was really cool. So yeah, it looks like this thing, it's mature. It's being used in a lot of places. I saw some really big names using this, Airbnb, Twitter, things like that. So I'm sure that if you're in the need for a high performance key value store, Redis is definitely going to be in your toolkit. And you probably already know about it anyways. You watch the show just to see how I'd screw up again. But yeah.
Yeah, I did some checking actually while we were, while you were talking. I did some checking. It turns out we're using it in a number of places internally to our company as well. So
cool. I'm kind of wondering if there's any large-scale company that you're aware of that isn't using it somewhere. I mean, it's probably one of those kinds of, everybody uses it sort of. And that's why I said at the beginning of the show, I think this is something everybody's using every day and doesn't know it. So, I'm sure any website you're going to visit today is probably going to be having it somewhere in the middle of that. We're actually wrapping the show a little short because we started a little late, but I do want to finish out the rest of my show here. So, any further comments before I go on and do the upcoming guests?
Oh no, but I was trying to give you a lead in there so you could pull out the upcoming guest, but too late. Oh.
I didn't pick it up.
Randall, what I'd really like to know about is what's coming up in the next few episodes of FLOSS Weekly.
Well, I can tell you that because that's exactly what I'm staring at. I mean, that's always what I'm doing when I hand it over to the coast. Say, like Aaron, what do you think? What I'm doing right then is I'm moving the upcoming guests so I can look at it straight ahead to the camera. It's a little trick I learned over the years. Always hand it to the co-host so that way I can slide the list up in the right place. So here we go. Here we are. Next week we have Brian Bellendorf. Real famous guy in the computer industry, and now working with Linux Foundation on Hyperledger, which is blockchain technology. Aaron, you like blockchains too. Do you want to come back next week too?
I better not. I better get some work done around here.
Okay, yeah. Anyway, we'll get somebody for the co-host for that. Jenkins after that, which is the leading CI/CD server. It's a fork of Hudson. We're going to talk about pitchforks because that was a hostile fork, of course. Containership, cross-platform deploying and managing containers. We're going to talk about the conference, allthingsopen.org. It's been running around for 5 years now. Done in the Research Triangle. We're going to have a couple of the conference coordinators come on and talk about that. I'm actually attending that show, so it'll be fun to talk in advance. And apparently there's 5,000 attendees. I had no idea that there was that big of a show that wasn't OSCON. So this is going to be great to have them talk about that. LibreOffice, we had them on 5 years ago, but things have changed. Everything always changes in 5 years, right? Might as well bring them back on. And speaking also of things changing, we'll bring Kazoo back on. That's cloud telephony. We have a very special co-host lined up for that. As long as everything goes right, we're crossing our fingers. Hiawatha Web Server after that, security-focused web server. Aqua Meta, which is a web dev environment designed around datafication using Postgres. And no, I don't understand what the word datafication is, but they have it in big, bold letters on their website. So that must mean something. Making it into data? I thought everything in Postgres already is data. Anyway, whatever. And then wrapping up the list of the people we have so far is Crail, which is a high-performance storage and networking solution. You can find out all about these and more at our big spreadsheet linked from twit.tv/floss, which is the homepage for the show. And if you have any other suggestions, please tell the community coordinator or project leader to email me, merlin@stonehenge.com. You don't have to write that down. Just go to twit.tv/floss. It's the only one URL you need to memorize for this show. Q3, I think, is just about full. We're always having more slots. They can always make more. In fact, actually opened up slots all the way to the end of the year. We have a live stream at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time on Wednesdays at live.twit.tv. We did not take any questions from there this week, I don't think. Maybe. I don't know. I can't remember. And you can follow us on Floss Weekly on Google+, or at Floss Weekly on Twitter. Follow me at Randall L. Schwartz on Google+, and at Merlin on Twitter. I'll be at DragonCon in a mere 6 weeks away, and I don't have my talk written yet. I'm scrambling every day now to finish my freaking talk. And I'll also be at the allthingsopen.org conference in October. That's over in the Research Triangle area. I'm actually going back to Cuba in February, this time not on a plane, on a cruise ship. So that'll be fun. One of my wonderful insight cruises. Going back to Cuba. Hopefully they won't change the rules too much more before February comes around. Any plugs you want to have, Aaron?
Yeah, of course. The biggest plug, well, one of the biggest plugs, I guess, is go check out my book, Linux for Makers. If you're new to Linux, and I know some of you are, I know it doesn't seem possible as an open source show for people to be new to Linux. There are some people out there that don't use it or just don't use it when they're building their projects, and you should be using it to build your projects. So go check out that book. You can find it at all the better bookstores that are still have their doors open, and online on Amazon as well. Yep. So definitely check that out. And again, just give a shout out to New Relic for appreciate them giving me some time to continue to do these shows, even though they keep me super busy over here.
Cool. Well, and thanks you once again for coming on the show, being a wonderful co-host, and thanks to your company for letting you have office space. I should mention also that I'm at ZipRecruiter this week, and but I did say that, didn't I, at the beginning of the show? Okay, good. Just want to make sure that because I'm using 3 hours of their office space here, I'm making sure that they don't actually get in trouble for it. Okay, I go to put it on the schedule every time. I mention them every time just to make sure that happens. So thanks, Aaron, once again, and we'll see you all again next week on Floss Weekly.